Hi. So now we're going to start talking about what thermodynamics actually is, and it's the study of energy and its transformation. When scientists discuss thermodynamics, they always do it in terms of what they're looking at, or the object being studied, which is called the system, and everything around the system that's called the surroundings. And so there's three types of systems. So when we look at here, an isolated system is one that doesn't exchange anything. So if you look here, when we're looking at the different types of systems, right? This that we're looking at and studying, this is a system. Everything around it is essentially the surroundings, right? So when we look at here, an isolated system, basically, what do you notice here? We have matter, the little blue circles, and energy, which looks like little suns. And what do we notice about inside between the system and the outside? There's no exchange. Everything stays within the system. That's an isolated system. An example of this is the universe. All the energy in the universe remains constant, which tells us since it's remaining constant, we're not losing anything, that essentially that the universe has to be an isolated system. So a closed system, what do you notice about here, the energy and the matter? Yes. The only thing that essentially is moving back and forth and being between the system and the surroundings is energy here, right? So a closed system means that we essentially are not putting material back in our matter essentially back and forth between the system and surroundings. So this is what's called closed. Energy is being exchanged, but matter is not. An example we give here is the greenhouse. When you have a greenhouse and it rains, the rain stays on the outside, right? And everything on the inside is protected. When you water everything on the inside in the greenhouse, essentially none of the water is going outside. All the plants and all of that stay within the greenhouse. Now, what does come through the glass is the sunlight. So energy comes in, matter does not. The last is an open system, and this is the idea, what do you notice between energy and matter? Both of them are openly exchanged. So this is the idea of the ocean, but what I would like to tell you more so, this is how organisms are. We essentially are an open system. We take in energy from the outside, we release energy. How? We eat. Inside the food, there are basically sugar molecules. Inside the sugar molecules are bonds, and we take the energy from those bonds. And then essentially, if we go run or we have excess heat, it gets released into our surroundings. Essentially, what happens is we have water on us, and essentially we take the heat from our body, evaporates that water. If you remember us talking about the heat of vaporization in Unit 2. And so basically that water gets evaporated into the atmosphere, and then essentially that is how it exchanges. We eat food, essentially we release matter whenever we go to the restroom. So essentially, or we spit, or we sweat, or we expunge out oxygen and we take in or we expend out carbon dioxide and take in oxygen. So essentially, we are considered an open system. Now, the first law of thermodynamics we've already talked about, and you can see this little bear eating, and Dr. B just loves bears, and then you can see the second law, he is running. And you see all these molecules everywhere. So let's talk about the first and second law of thermodynamics. The first we have already talked about, because when we're talking about essentially energy being interconvertible between potential and kinetic energy, we essentially were talking about the first law of thermodynamics that says energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It is just transferred from one thing to the next, right? So it's also called the principle of conservation of energy. So you're conserving energy because you're not just getting rid of it. And so the total amount remains constant, and we just go from one to the other. So when you burn log in the fireplace, essentially the wood in the log has chemical potential energy because essentially it's made of molecules and it's released, that energy, when it's burned. It's a combustion reaction. So the energy is basically released in the form of heat that you can feel and the light that you can see. The matter of the log essentially just change. You're not destroying the matter, you're just changing it into something else, which essentially is particle, ash, and soot. Rubbing your hands together generates heat on your palms. So essentially your muscles are taking the chemical energy in your body and allowing your muscles to contract. They're moving your hands essentially, or moving across the muscles themselves, producing friction. And that friction essentially is producing heat. And friction is the idea of there being something there that's resisting that movement. And that essentially produces heat on your skin. And another example of how this happens is plants capture kinetic energy or light energy, kinetic light energy, right? And they convert it to potential chemical energy in terms of making sugar for plants to use later. So all of those are examples of the first law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics is a little bit more complicated, but it's not really, if you think about it. It's just saying that over time, that everything becomes more disordered or random or chaotic. This term is known as entropy. And so everything in the universe is always going from what is known as ordered to disordered. And that for things to remain ordered takes a lot of energy, which is the reason why it doesn't happen. Now, as things go from order to disorder, energy can also be changed in something less useful, which is heat energy. And so heat energy essentially is one of the things that essentially can cause more chaos. So how I can explain this is you have a party, and before your party happens, you clean your house really, really, really well. Now, as you go through the party, what happens to your place? I mean, if you're having, say it's a sports party, everybody came over to essentially watch a game, or everybody came over to party for your birthday or for New Year's. Does your house stay really, really, really clean just naturally? No, it doesn't. It becomes completely chaotic. And if you want it to remain clean, you're putting a lot of energy in the entire time, throwing things away and cleaning your countertops and, making sure that old beer bottles or Coke cans or whatever are being thrown away. It's not something that just naturally happens. You take something, your clean apartment, right, that's very ordered, to your messy apartment or house afterwards. And so all of this goes from something that's highly ordered to more disordered. And this is happening in the universe as we speak, and it happens in your body. As you age, the longer you're alive, the more basically molecules that you generate that are waste molecules. So you have tons of waste molecules in your body that your body needs to get rid of. The more your body works, it kind of wears out over time, which means it's creating even more waste molecules that can't be used. So essentially, even your body goes from something that tends to be very ordered at first to becoming more and more disordered. Now, when we talk about total energy, you have a combination of energy that can be useful to do stuff and then unuseful energy. So this does stuff, right? Plus energy that's there that does really nada or nothing, right? So that's the reason why energy transformations increase the amount of entropy or disorder, because you have this amount of energy that's there that's completely unusable. Now, energy that's available to do work or to be useful energy, that's what's known as free energy, specifically Gibbs free energy, for coming up or postulating the theory behind this. So when we talk about applying the first and second laws of thermodynamics, we can essentially do this to allow for predictions, whether a reaction will happen what's known as spontaneously. And spontaneously just means, what is a spontaneous reaction? It will happen basically on its own. You do not need extra energy to help. Okay? So, this is the idea that if I had $1 in my pocket or $2, I know at any point, because I have enough money, I can go get a bag of chips. If I only have 50 cents in my pocket, that's not enough money for me to go get a bag of chips from the vending machine. So I couldn't just at any moment go do it. I would need to take time to look for more money to go buy the bag of chips. So with money, it would be considered spontaneous. Spontaneous would be, I have enough money to buy chips. If I didn't, not enough, that is a non-spontaneous reaction. Okay? And so essentially, spontaneous reactions are ones that happen without having to find extra energy for them. So when we're determining this, we need to know that, or make sure, the two factors that are used to determine whether a reaction will be spontaneous or happen on its own is it going from being ordered to disordered? Because we already know if it's the opposite, it's not going to happen. You don't go from disordered to ordered. And is there enough energy for it to happen? So when we talk about entropy happening, essentially here we are talking about the entropy. Reactants are going to be less ordered. Reactants are less ordered. Or reactants, there's less chaos here, right? So essentially, these are more ordered. When we're talking about products, we're talking about more chaos or being more disordered. So that's what we're doing here. We're talking about entropy, and essentially, in order for a reaction to be spontaneous, it has to go from being ordered to disordered. Now, when we're talking about energy, right, an energy diagram looks something like this. And this is what a spontaneous reaction is going to look like. So this is time here, going here. So over time, and this is the amount of energy. Okay? And so on here, we have what are known as reactants. So this is the energy of the reactants. What do you think this is the energy of? This is the energy of products, right? So one thing you should notice here is that essentially you have more energy for the reactants than you have the products, right? So this is the idea of money. I have more money. I essentially have enough money to make the products. This would be, I have $2 here. The products cost maybe 50 cents. I have way enough money. So this essentially is called the change in energy, or delta G. Now up here, this right here is what's known as a transition. So over time, what we're looking at here is, this is the reactants, over time, these guys are going to change into products. So this is our reaction mechanism. Right? So this is the reactants here. This is the products here. Okay? And essentially, this is how much energy is up here, and this is how much energy is here. So delta G is the amount of energy essentially change. So what's going to happen here, energy is going to leave or be released because we have enough of it. Now the transition state is somewhere in the middle of this. This is where they look a little bit like both. They look like the reactants and the products both. That's what a transition state is, right? Now, the amount of energy we need for a reaction to start is here. This is what we see as a big E with a little a, or it's known as, and I'm going to write it over here, activation energy. And we're going to talk more about this later. So this is what we need for a reaction to be spontaneous. If it doesn't look like this, it won't be spontaneous. So for instance, if you look here and you had something that looked like this would be a non-spontaneous reaction because you see the energy of the products is here and you need all this energy for it to happen. This, you're looking for energy elsewhere. So spontaneous reactions just mean that you don't need additional energy for it to happen. It doesn't necessarily mean it's fast. It can be slow. The key factor in it is just the amount of free energy that's there and that there is enough. So when we're talking about Gibbs free energy, or that delta G that we were looking at, or how much energy that's there, if it's spontaneous, it's going to be negative. So if it's like negative 200 joules or something like that, that tells us there's 200 joules of energy left that you can do something with, right? It's kind of the idea if you go to Walmart and they give you a refund, on the refund it says negative like $12 because that's the amount that's left over, that's extra. Like you go in and you're like, oh, I don't like this painting I got for my house, or I don't like this rug. And so I want to take it back and I want to get a different rug. And so you take it up there and they're like, okay, you have a $100 credit and you go get a rug that only takes $75. Well, you still have $25 left over. So on the receipt, the thing's going to say negative 25 because that's essentially what they're giving back to you. If you owe it, they basically on the thing, it'll say $25, right? If what you bring back is $125, they're going to go, okay, you owe us 25. So that's positive because that's the amount that you have to give them still. If it's negative, that's the amount that's extra that they're going to give back to you. So hopefully that makes sense why when you're looking at how much energy is there, it's essentially negative because that's how much left over that they can use for whatever they're going to do. So essentially, if you have extra energy left over, a lot of times they're going to release it. And if it's extra, it's going to release, and it's called exergonic, right? And think exit from the reaction. So if the reactants have this much energy, the products have this is going to be negative, and this is the amount we're releasing, right? Endergonic means we have to have stuff enter, E-N-T-E-R. So I think E-N as in enter. So the reactants only have this much. You need this much to be products. That's how much we need to go out and find. Now, they have other terms for this as well. and it's called exothermic and endothermic, and thermic stands for temp. So exothermic, again, release of heat. Endothermic, again, heat enters. So the only difference here is the thermic meaning temperature. Exer, you can think gonic. G comes from the Gibbs free energy. So that can kind of help you a little bit on determining what the terms mean. And this is just, again, looking at the exothermic coming from essentially energy being released. And when we're talking about energy in general, the term is enthalpy. Earlier, when we were talking about, just to go back to show you, when we were talking earlier, we're talking about entropy here. You see, having to be disordered. But this term that just generally refers to energy is enthalpy, not entropy. So notice there's a bit of a difference. This is disorder. This is just temperature. So exothermic means release of heat. Endothermic means interheat. So if you have these kind of reactions, this one is going to feel hot because the heat is being released so you can feel it. If you have this, it's going to feel cold around it because it's taking the heat from the surroundings and bringing it in. Now, we talked a little bit about mitochondria, and mitochondria are the energy, right? The powerhouse of the cell are energy generators. And they're energy generators because they make this molecule called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. And essentially the purpose of ATP, it powers all of the cellular working or reactions by coupling it to reactions that are actually coupling the reaction to break down ATP, that is exothermic, to reactions that are endothermic or do not have enough energy to happen. So they can do it through chemical. The kind of work that it's responsible for is chemical work, transport, or mechanical work, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. So essentially what happens, and we're almost done with this, when we don't have enough energy for a reaction to occur, we can make this molecule called adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate comes from, there are 3 phosphates here. And when we're looking at nucleotides, this is essentially a nucleotide, like what we see or find in nucleic acids. And so you can see the sugar here and the base here, and this is the phosphate, right? There just happens to be 3 of them. And so essentially what happens is water will come in through a hydrolysis reaction, if you remember that. Hopefully you guys remembered it and studied for it. And essentially what happens is we break the bond here, right? Phosphate will leave, make ADP, and the process of breaking that bond and then reforming this OH at the end will allow energy to be released to something else. So it has extra energy. It has 7.3 kcals per mole. And just to know, a mole is a certain concentration, right? We talked about this a little bit, of it having to do with a certain number of molecules. And kcals is just another way to look at energy in the terms of calories. Kcal means 1,000 calories, right? And so this can be used to give reactions a little bit more energy if they don't have enough next to them. It's called coupling. Now, when we go, basically, our body is constantly doing this. It's basically hydrolyzing to help help reactions that are endogonic, right? Doesn't have enough energy. And then essentially will synthesize through what's known as cellular metabolism That's where we make most of it, so that we can have it for other reactions. So it's a constant process that we're doing continuously throughout the day. So just to review, exergonic means spontaneous. The G amount will be negative, and that means energy is released by the reaction, so it can be used by other reactions. Endergonic means that it's not spontaneous. Essentially there, what you'll want is it'll be a positive amount. You'll need free energy from if it's this reaction from something else, and essentially it requires energy to drive the reaction. And ATP, the cell uses the hydrolysis mechanism to couple it to other reactions that essentially are endergonic. And this is important because essentially when we look at this, we need ATP to do things like help for carrier proteins that go and transport molecules. A lot of times, these require some kind of energy. And so ATP can use for certain instances for that to happen. Or when we're looking at motor proteins and things walking, right? Essentially, we will be there to help things to move. And this is pretty cool because essentially ATP, each ATP molecule in your body goes through about 10,000 cycles of this breaking down and resynthesizing, hydrolysis, resynthesizing it. Amino acid sequences in proteins a lot of times function as this ATP binding site to allow this to happen or to get energy from ATP. We can predict whether a newly discovered protein uses ATP or not. And that will tell us essentially if these proteins work through an endogonic process or exogonic process. About 20% of all proteins actually bind ATP on average, and likely an underestimate because there may be other types of ATP binding sites that we don't look at. It basically helps to illustrate how important ATP is as a source. And next week, we're actually going to talk more about how we make ATP. So adenosine triphosphate, the whole overall purpose of this molecule is like change. What you're going to see next week is we're going to take something like glucose that has a lot of energy in its bonds, and our body's going to break it down to make ATP. And so it's the idea that when you get your check every month, you could have hundreds of dollars there, or the bank may be like, here's a $100 bill, and you'll go, no one takes $100 bills. I need you to break this down into ones, fives, tens, and 20s. And so the $100 bill is like glucose. The 1, 5, 10s, and 20s, that's like ATP. And essentially, you need sometimes ATP to go in and help reactions to happen. And so essentially what we're going to talk about in class is, or in the next lecture, is essentially what metabolism is. So we are done with this part of the lecture, and we will continue at a later point.